Hello guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I wanted to do a bit of discussion on a brand new unique shield that's come into the game in patch 0.5, which is the Eyes of the Runefather. And this shield has some really interesting mechanics to do with monster power, so I wanted to cover a few of the interactions that you could use in this patch and maybe inspire some buildcraft. This character right now is basically just a testing character. I haven't got really any passive tree or anything spec'd, but I have picked up this shield to kind of see how it works. And I think there's actually some really interesting things going on here. So let's go through some of the mechanics of how this shield actually works. Then I'll go through some interactions that you could use. This is a shield that inflicts a new debuff on targets when you actually raise your shield or when you hit targets with an offhand attack. And that is a debuff called Runefather's Challenge. So Runefather's Challenge is a debuff which raises the power of affected targets by 5. And you can actually see that right here. When I raise my shield, there's kind of this wave in front of me, and that happens at a minimum of every 2 seconds. When you raise your shield, you actually get this wave in front of you, and anything in a 6-meter radius in front of you there will be inflicted with this debuff. So this debuff does nothing other than raising the power of affected targets by 5. This is basically a way to roughly estimate how difficult a monster is. So a normal monster will have a power of around 1, that's kind of your most basic average monster, and then you can get very weak monsters which may have as low as 0.5 power. That might be the kind of monsters that you see crawling around on the ground that barely do any damage. Then as you kind of scale up the tiers in terms of difficulty, some monsters that are very difficult will have a base power of 2 or even 3, and that's the baseline power that's assigned to that particular monster type. Then you have an extra multiplier that goes on here based on monster rarity. So if it's a normal monster or a white monster, that's going to be a 1 multiplier, so the base power is the same. And then with magic monsters or blue monsters, that multiplier is 2, so that base power gets multiplied by 2, and that's your total power. Then for rares, it's multiplied by 5. And unique monsters, for example, things like rogue exiles or map bosses, they always have 20 power. Now, this mechanic is used for quite a few things in the game. It used to be something that which is kind of exclusive to, war cries and things like that, but now there's a lot of mechanics that use this system. For example, things like triggers use this system to determine how much energy they grant, and there are other things there as well. We'll go through some of those in just a moment. So, the important thing about this debuff here is that it raises the power of affected targets by 5, and if you have a monster which is just kind of a basic average white monster in front of you, their base power is going to be 1. So being able to raise that from 1 to 6 is really quite impactful for some particular interactions that you can make use of. But before we get into that, let's see what else this shield does. Let's move these things up here. So this shield also has something here which is, when you've actually inflicted the debuff on monsters, you gain 1 Runefather's Boast per power of targets affected by Runefather's Challenge that you kill. So Runefather's Boast is a new buff, and this is a permanent buff, unlike, many buffs that are duration based. It stays on you for the entirety of that zone unless you die or then move on, portal out or move on to a new zone. That's when it will disappear. But this buff can stack up to 10,000, but you gain the buff in stacks of 1 per monster power that you kill with this debuff. So this debuff, as I said, is going to raise the power of the target by 5, and if you kill a basic monster that had 1 power, that's going to be 6. So you're going to gain 6 Runefather's Boast from that 1 kill, and then it stacks up to 10,000. Each stack is granting +1 to armor, +1 to evasion rating, and +1 to stun threshold. So this doesn't seem like much, but once you're at that 10,000, that's really granting a lot of armor and a lot of evasion rating, and there's also the stun threshold there. This is a kind of crazy amount of stun threshold. If you consider a normal character which might have, 3,000 life in the endgame, maybe even less than that, 2,000 life, something like that, their base threshold is 100% of that. So, 2,000 base threshold, you can then improve that with modifiers to stun threshold, increase stun threshold, things like that. But getting a huge amount of stun threshold here from this, and that's also added on top of your life, well, you're basically not going to get stunned at all. So this is really quite powerful. And then, of course, the armor and evasion rating is quite strong as well, especially if you have a character that can scale that flat armor and evasion rating. If we go over here and look at the passive tree, there is something you could consider, for example, which is Iron Reflexes, which would mean that you'd be gaining 20,000 flat armor from this buff when it's at 10,000. so that's quite powerful. But this is not really the main thing that I'm interested in when it comes to this shield. This is just a nice bonus on top. So one other thing to note before we move on to some of the interactions there is that this debuff right here, even though it doesn't actually specify a duration, this is not a permanent debuff like the buff that you get from this. This lasts for about 9 or 10 seconds from what I can tell. So this is not a permanent debuff, but if you're kind of playing around offhand attacks and things like that, then you're probably going to be able to pretty much reliably always have this on monsters. And there's always the case that, you know, you're going to have multiple ways to actually apply this, because offhand attack hits are going to apply it. Things like shield charge or resonating shield, for example, will apply this. And then you're also going to have that initial wave when you actually raise your shield at the start there, which has a very large area. Now, I made a video last league in 0.4 discussing a bug fix, which was actually fixed with no documentation at all. And it's really quite an important bug fix, because before that, the way how prevented damage worked in regards to blocks was that it wasn't really counted as prevented damage for these types of mechanics. So you basically couldn't benefit from things like Scarred Faith when it came to blocking, but that is not the case anymore. This does actually work for blocks hits. So if you block a hit, by default the entirety of the damage is prevented, and then percentage of the physical damage that's being prevented in that hit is recouped as energy shield over time, and that is based on monster power. So you can see there, per enemy power is 5% of prevented physical damage, and you can imagine there, if you are using this shield, then that basic monster that was 1 power is now 6 power, which means that instead of getting 5% of physical damage recouped as energy shield, you're getting 30% just from that basic monster. So I wanted to mention this one because I did talk about that in that previous video in 0.4, how it can be really, really powerful in terms of a recovery mechanic once you're actually investing into block. So you do need to be aware of how this keystone actually works. You can't recharge energy shield anymore, you can't regenerate energy shield, and you also have that line there where you cannot recover energy shield to above armor, which means you do need to scale armor up a little bit. But this keystone is definitely something to consider, and I will link that 0.4 video in the description below, because that does actually have some important mechanics there in terms of this keystone, and that interaction is really quite strong. Now, the next one that I want to mention here is the Smith of Kitava, which has the notable Heat of the Forge, and Heat of the Forge grants the Fire Spell on Hit skill. And Fire Spell on Hit is basically an energy gaining mechanic. It's a trigger mechanic like the other trigger skills there, but this one, it gains energy based on melee attacks that you perform, and once again, the base energy here is coming from the monster power. So again, you can take a look at the example there that I mentioned before with the keystone, and this is gaining 3 base energy per power of enemies you hit. So if you were hitting that normal monster that had 1 power, it was granting 3 base energy, which is then modified by the percentage of enemy's ailment threshold that the hit is going to deal in terms of the damage. And with the Runefather's challenge debuff on that monster, they now have 6 base power. So instead of gaining 3 energy that's then modified by the damage, it's 18 energy, which is a crazy difference. So this is definitely something you could look at. A Smith of Kitava build that uses the Eyes of the Runefather shield, that might be quite interesting. And in the same vein there, you have the Mjölner weapon, which has basically the same skill there in Thunder God's Wrath. And Thunder God's Wrath is pretty much the lightning version of Fire Spell on Hit. So once again, it has, you know, the same mechanics there, gain 3 energy per power. And once again, this will be so much more if you're using that debuff. So that is also something that you could look at. And another thing I want to mention here is banners, because War Banner, Defiance Banner, and Dread Banner, they all have this mechanic which generates glory based on monster power of the monsters that you're hitting with attacks. And once again, this is a high glory skill, so it takes a while to actually get there, but with Runefather's challenge, you'll be able to get there much quicker. This means you'll have a higher uptime on banners, and that is something that you could look at. Additionally, you have all of the other trigger spells there, you know, the ones that are not Fire Spell or Thunder God's Wrath. You have things like Cast on Crit, for example, Cast on Elemental Ailment. All of these are based on monster power, so when it comes to mapping, and you're kind of like, you know, zooming around the map, having this debuff on monsters is going to allow you to trigger your skills much more often. And you can kind of look through this list here. There are quite a lot of interactions you could make use of with this shield. The last one I want to mention there is Ancestral Cry, because I do think you can kind of do something there. Perhaps, as I said, on the Smith of Kitava with Fire Spell on Hit, maybe you could also incorporate this into your build, because once again, this is gaining glory based on monster power. and that comes from actually igniting enemies. So, you know, you can kind of play into that and use the debuff to gain a lot more glory and pretty much have this up more often. But that is going to be it for this video. I just wanted to kind of showcase this shield a little bit because I think it's really cool. I might try and make a build around this when it comes to things like Mjölner. I think there might be something interesting there with, you know, maybe you could do something on the Oracle or something like that. But this shield is really quite fun. And if you're wondering why I haven't been doing any videos over the last few days, it's because there's a crazy heat wave right now in the UK, which is, I'm just melting. But other than that, you know, all good. And I'm sure I'll be back to making sort of more regular videos in the coming days because the heat wave should be going away here at some point. But yeah, that's it for this video. I just wanted to do a bit of discussion on this shield. I think it's pretty cool. Go out there and make some builds with the Eyes of the Runefather. Thanks for watching this video. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.